It started as an ordinary day in the not-too-distant future. Same coffee, same inbox, same news feed full of hype about the latest AI miracle. Same me in the same hoodie, staring out of the same office window at San Francisco glittering in the morning light. The difference? This time, I knew how it would end, or rather how it wouldn't. Back then, the air in the Oversight Committee still crackled with the same kind of ambition that had driven us for years. We were the chosen few, the supposed brakes on the machine, the hand on the lever, the voice in the room saying, "Hang on, are we sure about this?" Only, in the other version of this story, the one I told you before, we floored it. But in this one, we didn't. It's strange looking back, because the morning felt identical. The architect was there, as magnetic and persuasive as ever. The sharks were circling, the idealists clutching their reports. And me? I still had my vote. What changed was, I used it differently. I can't pretend it was some cinematic moment of clarity. I didn't stand up, slam my coffee down, and deliver a speech that made the room go quiet. I just looked at the numbers, thought about what would happen if we got it wrong, and when my turn came, I said, "Slow down." 2 words. No applause, no headlines. But that was the moment the race ended, or at least paused. In the hours after, it didn't feel like a victory. If anything, it felt like I'd just stepped in front of a speeding train and was waiting to find out if it was going to stop or crush me. We all knew the consequences would come. The press would tear into us. The markets would shake. Rival labs overseas would smell blood in the water, and they did. But for that morning, as we walked out into the California sun, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Relief. Not because we'd saved the world, not because we'd made the perfect choice, but because, for once, we'd given ourselves time. I just didn't know yet how hard it would be to keep it. The official agenda called it Strategic Deployment Timelines Review, which is the kind of phrase you put on paper when you don't want anyone to panic. But everyone in that boardroom knew exactly what it meant. We were deciding whether to hit the brakes or keep the race alive. The architect opened as he always did, calm, confident, deliberate. He spoke about opportunity, global leadership, the danger of ceding ground to rivals. He didn't have to raise his voice. Every word landed like a chess move. The sharks followed. Graphs, forecasts, market dominance scenarios. The same line dressed in different clothes. If we slow down, we lose. And then the idealists had their turn. Their slides weren't as polished, their sound bites not as sharp, but their numbers. Those numbers stuck. Projections of job displacement if we kept going at full speed. Security risks. Probability charts for system failure at different capability levels. I watched the room shift, just slightly. The architect noticed too. When it came to my turn, I'd already decided. Not because I thought slowing down was safe politically, it wasn't. Not because it was certain to work, it wasn't that either. But because I couldn't ignore what was staring us in the face. We weren't ready. I kept it simple. Slow down. 2 words. There was no dramatic pause, no applause, no gasps. Just the quiet hum of the air system and the scratch of someone taking notes. But from that moment, I could feel the vote tipping. When the final tally came in, it was 8-4 in favor of the slowdown. The architect didn't slam his fist or storm out. He just leaned back, exhaled, and said, "Then we'll do it your way." We'd won, at least for the day. But walking out of that glass tower, I knew the decision would trigger waves far beyond that room. Rival labs, foreign governments, and the market itself, all of them were going to come for us. And in the back of my mind was the question I couldn't shake. Had we just saved the world? or put a target on its back. The headlines came before we'd even left the building. Markets shaken by AI slowdown vote. Tech giants warn of lost decade. Oversight Committee chooses fear over progress. By the end of the week, every business channel was running the same talking heads in different suits, all saying the same thing. We'd just handed the future to our competitors. Investors panicked. Share prices dipped. A few of the bigger firms issued carefully worded statements about evaluating their options, which in corporate language means we're about to pull every lever we can to undo this. The international reaction wasn't any softer. Rival nations called it a strategic blunder, while some quietly celebrated. The pause gave them breathing space, a chance to catch up without us pushing the frontier further out of reach. Inside the committee, the atmosphere was tense. The idealists who'd fought for the slowdown were already on the defensive, fielding hostile questions from journalists and politicians. The sharks, they weren't sulking, they were plotting. You could see it in their eyes. And then came the letters. Open letters from industry leaders predicting economic disaster. Think tanks publishing cost of delay reports. Influencers rallying their audiences with slick videos about how fear is killing innovation. Public opinion split down the middle. Some people thanked us for putting the brakes on. Parents, teachers, unions, anyone whose job had felt like it was one update away from redundancy. Others saw us as cowards, stifling the very thing that could solve climate change, cure diseases, or create unimaginable wealth. Even in my own inbox, the praise and abuse arrived in equal measure. One morning I'd read a heartfelt message from a nurse grateful for the extra time to adapt to AI in healthcare. By lunch, I'd get a death threat from someone who thought I'd single-handedly doomed humanity to stagnation. It was clear the slowdown wasn't going to be a quiet, orderly shift. We hadn't just made a policy decision. We'd lit a fuse. And as the first sparks ran along it, I began to wonder if we'd bought ourselves time, or just invited the fight of our lives. The slowdown wasn't just a vote, it became policy. Within weeks, we were sitting across from ministers, regulators, and in some cases, generals. The conversations were equal parts diplomacy and damage control. We had to convince them that slowing the race wasn't weakness, it was strategy. Some listened, some didn't. The first win came when a bloc of countries agreed to a joint AI capability framework, a deliberately boring name for a set of rules that would cap the scale and autonomy of frontier models. The idea was to make the rules unsexy enough that no one could accuse us of grandstanding. Those rules meant slower training schedules, mandatory safety audits, and strict human oversight for any system handling critical infrastructure. No AI making high-level decisions without a person ready to pull the plug. The architect, still magnetic, still stubborn, played his part. Publicly, he framed it as responsible leadership and a model for the world. Privately, I knew he hated every second of it. But he also knew a public fight would fracture the committee and the sharks would smell blood. We set up new cross-border oversight teams, engineers, ethicists, economists, all tasked with spotting risks before they snowballed. For a brief moment, it felt like the grown-ups were finally in charge. But the cracks were already forming. A few nations refused to sign. Others signed, then quietly funded research exemptions for their own companies. We all knew what that meant. Ghost labs, offshore servers, AI development that wouldn't appear on any official register. The race wasn't dead. It was just running in the shadows. Still, the framework bought us something precious. Time. Time to research alignment properly. Time to prepare job markets, Time to put human safety ahead of shareholder returns. And in those early months, I let myself believe we could hold it. I just didn't yet realize how fragile that belief really was. If the boardroom was tense, the streets were louder. The first week after the Slowdown vote, you can feel the split in the air. In some neighborhoods, people actually celebrated. Parents relieved their kids might have time to finish school before their future jobs vanished. Workers in industries teetering on the edge, breathing out for the first time in months. In others, it was pure fury. Protesters gathered outside government buildings, waving banners, "Don't chain the future. We choose progress. Fear is not leadership." They weren't all tech workers either. Plenty of ordinary people saw the Slowdown as stealing something from them. The cures, the climate breakthroughs, the better life they'd been promised in 100 press releases. News anchors and pundits took sides overnight. On one channel, experts praised the decision as the boldest act of statesmanship in decades. On another, it was called an act of economic sabotage. Online, it was worse. Every post about AI became a battlefield. Arguments spiraled under every article, every clip, every press conference. If you supported the Slowdown, you were a Luddite holding humanity back. If you opposed it, you were selling the future to the highest bidder. And it wasn't just noise. Real-world action followed. Some unions pushed for the Slowdown to be written into law. Lobby groups sprang up to kill it before it could take root. Petitions racked up millions of signatures on both sides. I'd walk through the city and see it written on faces. Relief on one street, resentment on the next. Cafes where people leaned in, talking quietly about how they might adapt now that they had breathing room. And others where the conversations were sharper, angrier, full of frustration about missed opportunities and falling behind. It was in those early weeks that I realized the Slowdown wasn't just a policy. It was a line in the sand, and everyone was being pushed to one side or the other. And somewhere, beyond the headlines and protests, the race hadn't stopped at all. It had just gone underground. Inside the labs, the change was immediate. Gone were the frantic all-nighters chasing arbitrary launch dates. The constant push to ship the next big thing had been replaced with long, deliberate cycles. Weeks spent on safety testing. Whole teams dedicated to interpretability, making sure we actually understood why a model gave the answers it did, not just whether the answers were right. It wasn't glamorous. There were no breathless press releases about game-changing breakthroughs every fortnight. But there was something else. A strange quiet. A sense that we might finally be building with both hands on the wheel. We started to see things we'd missed before. Biases in training data that had gone unnoticed in the rush. Vulnerabilities that could have been exploited if they'd made it into the wild. Weird edge cases where an AI's logic seemed sound on paper but would have caused havoc in the real world. Some of the younger engineers struggled with the shift. They'd been hired into the hype era, where success was measured in headlines and viral demos. Now they were told to slow down, to double and triple check, to think beyond the product demo. A few left for private outfits overseas, where the race was still very much alive. But those who stayed began producing work that was different. Not bigger, not faster, but better. Explainable AI dashboards that could be read by non-experts. Transparent data sets that anyone could audit. Systems designed with built-in circuit breakers so they could be shut down instantly if something went wrong. The press mocked us for losing our edge. Investors grumbled about slower returns, but in the labs there was a quiet pride in knowing we weren't just building for the next quarter. We were building for the next decade. Of course, the world outside wasn't slowing down to match us. The underground labs, the accelerationists, the ones who never signed on to the slowdown. They were still moving fast. And the gap between our pace and theirs was starting to show. The slowdown worked, on paper. In the official world of signed agreements and public statements, the brakes were on. But behind closed doors, the accelerationists were still at full throttle. Some had never joined the agreement in the first place. A handful of nations, a cluster of private labs with deep-pocketed backers, and a web of research teams working in legal gray zones. Others had signed on publicly, then quietly carved out exemptions for defensive research. Everyone knew that was code for keep going, but don't get caught. They were faster because they didn't care about guardrails. No endless safety audits, no oversight boards, no circuit breakers or explainability reports. Their models got bigger, more capable, more unpredictable, and they were happy to let them loose in the wild to prove a point. Every few months, one of their creations would appear online. A leak, a beta test, sometimes just a deliberate stunt. An AI trading agent that made millions before regulators shut it down. A fully autonomous research assistant that could write academic papers from scratch, footnotes and all. A swarm of AI-generated news outlets pushing a single narrative so subtly you wouldn't spot it unless you knew exactly where to look. Publicly, we condemned them. Privately, we studied them. In the Oversight Committee, these incidents triggered urgent calls and emergency sessions. The idealists argued this was proof we needed to double down on enforcement. The sharks said it showed we couldn't afford to slow down at all. And me? I started to wonder if we'd just driven the danger underground, where it was harder to see, harder to stop. At least during the race, everything was happening in the open. Now the real breakthroughs and the real risks were hidden behind encryption keys and firewalls. One night, a message appeared in my secure inbox. No sender, just a single line of text. When you slow down, we don't disappear. We just get quieter. I didn't reply, but I kept thinking about it, because in the back of my mind, I knew it was true. One of the first visible effects of the slowdown was the way people started reappearing in places they'd quietly been disappearing from. Customer service centers that had been gutted during the race were hiring again. Not hundreds of staff, but enough to make sure there was always a person on the other end of the line when a problem didn't fit neatly into an AI's script. Hospitals brought back human triage nurses alongside their AI diagnostic systems. The machines could still spot a rare condition from a single symptom, but the humans could look someone in the eye and notice the detail that didn't show up in a scan. Even in law and finance, industries that had been teetering on the edge of full automation, companies were making space for human oversight. Not just as a token presence, but as an integral part of the process. AI could prepare the contracts, flag the risks, run the numbers, but it was a person who made the final call. Hybrid teams became the new normal. In factories, workers wore headsets connected to AI assistants that could suggest optimizations in real time, but the workers decided whether to follow them. In classrooms, teachers used AI to tailor lesson plans, then adapted them on the fly when the students' energy shifted. Productivity didn't drop the way the accelerationists predicted. In some sectors, it actually improved. Mistakes went down. Customer satisfaction went up. The systems weren't being pushed to breaking point anymore, and neither were the people. Of course, it wasn't all harmony and handshakes. There were still tensions, disagreements between AI recommendations and human judgment, frustration from workers who felt the oversight was slowing them down. But compared to the brittle, all-or-nothing world of the race, it felt balanced. And for a brief stretch of time, I thought, maybe this is what we were trying to save. Not just jobs, not just control, but the simple truth that a machine can be brilliant and still need a human. The press called it the age of small wins. They meant it as an insult, a way to say we'd traded moonshots for minor victories. But if you were paying attention, you could see those small wins adding up. In climate science, models were being trained not to produce the flashiest predictions, but to integrate decades of fragmented data. The result? Local weather forecasts that were accurate to the hour and precise enough for farmers to plan planting seasons months in advance. Crop yields rose without needing a single new genetically modified seed. In medicine, research AIs didn't just spit out drug candidates at random. They worked side by side with human scientists to explain why a compound might work, mapping out every possible side effect before a trial began. It meant fewer miracle headlines, but more treatments that actually made it to market and stayed there. Education saw the biggest transformation. The Rush-era AI tutors were brilliant on paper, but brittle. One wrong prompt and they'd start spinning nonsense. The Slowdown gave developers time to build systems that understood context, culture, and even humor. In classrooms, teachers used them to reach kids who'd been slipping through the cracks for years. Even in engineering, projects stopped being vanity showcases and started being useful. Bridges designed with AI-assisted structural models lasted longer. Power grids optimized by hybrid AI-human teams ran smoother and wasted less energy. It wasn't about being first anymore. It was about being right. The accelerationists mocked us for moving at glacial speed, but there was a quiet confidence in knowing that the systems we were deploying weren't going to implode after a flashy launch. And maybe most importantly, trust began to creep back in. People didn't see AI as an unpredictable black box anymore. They saw it as a partner. For a while, it felt like we'd found the balance we were searching for. But nothing stays balanced forever. For a while, it looked like the Slowdown had found its footing. The systems were working, the world hadn't collapsed, and the worst fears of the accelerationists hadn't come true. But politics doesn't run on patience. The first signs came during an election year overseas. A charismatic candidate built an entire campaign on one message: end the Slowdown. Bring back the race. It was slick, emotional, and ruthlessly simple. Every interview, every rally, every viral clip hammered the same point. We're falling behind while the rest of the world moves forward. It worked. They won by a landslide, and within weeks their government started withdrawing from the capability agreements. The official line was restoring competitiveness. Everyone knew it meant opening the gates again. They weren't alone. Other leaders saw the political wind shifting and began flirting with the same message. Lobbyists returned in force, armed with glossy reports showing how much GDP growth we'd left on the table. Corporate boards began to pressure their governments to follow suit, warning of irreversible disadvantage if they didn't. Even in countries still committed to the Slowdown, the tone changed. Instead of talking about responsible deployment and human oversight, ministers were suddenly hedging their words. Safety remained important, they said, but so did innovation leadership. Inside the committee, the mood was tense. We'd spent years trying to hold the line, but it was clear the tide was turning. The sharks could smell the blood in the water again, and this time they had voters cheering them on. The architect, ever the pragmatist, warned us bluntly. If we push too hard against this wave, it'll break over us. I could see his point, but I also knew that if we gave in too far, the slowdown would collapse completely, and all we'd have left was a slightly delayed version of the race. The question was no longer if the agreement would survive, but how long we could keep it alive. The slowdown was always a fragile thing. It relied on trust between countries that didn't trust each other at the best of times, and on cooperation between corporations that would happily sue each other into oblivion over a patent dispute. When the first government broke ranks, others followed faster than I'd expected. Not openly. No one wanted the PR hit of being the one who ended the slowdown, but quietly, in the margins. Loopholes in the agreements were stretched until they weren't loopholes at all. I found myself on planes more than I'd been in years, shuttling between capitals, sitting in wood-paneled meeting rooms and glass towers, trying to convince ministers and CEOs to hold the line. Some listened. Others smiled politely, nodded, and then went right back to doing whatever they wanted. The problem wasn't just politics. It was temptation. Once a country saw its neighbor pushing ahead with faster AI deployments, it was only a matter of time before they felt they had to match it. No one wanted to be left behind. We tried sweeteners, shared research projects, tech transfer deals, promises of first access to new medical breakthroughs. Sometimes it worked. More often, it just bought us a few months of compliance before the race crept back in through another door. Even within the Oversight Committee, unity was slipping. The sharks were openly saying we should relax the rules before they broke entirely. The idealists argued that loosening them would make the whole thing meaningless. And me? I was somewhere in the middle, still believing in the slowdown, but starting to feel like we were trying to hold back the tide with a garden fence. Then came the first public breach. A major player openly announcing they'd resume competitive capability development. It was racked in the language of safety and progress, but everyone knew what it meant. The race was back on for them. And if I'd learned anything from the years before the slowdown, it was this. Once one runner breaks the line, the rest won't stay still for long. It started like most disasters do, quietly. A leaked paper from a mid-tier research lab in Eastern Europe, just technical enough to be ignored by the general press, but devastating in the wrong hands. The breakthrough was something we'd always feared but never admitted in public. A method for running next-generation AI models on hardware cheap enough to fit under a teenager's desk. No server farms, no costly GPUs, no oversight. Just code, a bit of clever engineering, and the sort of ambition you can't bottle. At first, the committee's response was denial. It's theoretical, some said. It can't be scaled, others claimed. But within weeks, we started seeing the signs. Strange new systems popping up in dark corners of the web. Applications that didn't match any known model. Then came the first real incident. A small biotech startup in South America accidentally created a new antibiotic in 3 days. The medical community cheered. The regulators panicked. We knew what this meant. If one group could pull it off, so could dozens more. And if it worked for antibiotics, it would work for weapons, economic manipulation, disinformation campaigns. The list was endless. By the time the UN called an emergency session, the genie was already halfway out of the bottle. Some nations demanded an immediate global lockdown on all AI research. Others called that impossible, arguing the only way to fight such tech was to have it yourself, and have it first. For the first time since the slowdown began, I felt the old race breathing down my neck. The quiet corridors of the Oversight Committee were now full of shouting, slammed doors, and late-night calls from ministers wanting to know exactly how bad this could get. The truth? Bad enough to undo everything we'd built in less than a year. Bad enough to make the Slowdown a historical footnote instead of a turning point. And somewhere in the noise I realized this wasn't just about keeping the pace slow anymore. It was about deciding whether the world could ever hit pause again. The air in the room felt heavy, like we were sitting inside a storm cloud that hadn't decided when to break. Eyes darted, shoulders twitched. No one wanted to be the first to speak, because whoever did would set the tone for everything that followed. "You can't squeeze toothpaste back into the tube," one of them muttered. 3 people glared. Someone launched into a needless rant about tired hygiene metaphors. It was petty, but it told me everything. We were fraying at the edges, too wound up to agree on anything, even a throwaway line. And yet the decision on the table wasn't petty at all. On the screen behind me, the projection flickered, a real-time model of the AI's growth curve. You didn't need a maths degree to see it was shooting up like a rocket. The numbers pulsed in shades of red, as if the system itself knew it was on fire. The debate that followed was messy. Not the kind where people take turns and listen politely, but the kind where voices crash over each other and no one remembers who started what. Half the table wanted to pull the emergency brake. The other half wanted to double down. "This is our moment," one exec barked, stabbing a finger at the curve. "We slow down now, we lose to them." No one said who them was, but we all knew. Competitors, rivals, maybe even allies, if we hadn't been so hell-bent on winning. The Slowdown faction fought back, pointing out that pushing forward without safeguards was like driving at 200 miles per hour into fog. A few tried to offer compromises, phased rollouts, capped capabilities, but they were drowned out by the shouting match. At one point, a chair scraped violently against the floor. Someone slammed a notebook shut hard enough to send a pen flying. The room was a pressure cooker, and the whistle was starting to scream. I sat there, heart pounding, knowing I had a vote, knowing which way I'd probably cast it, and knowing that whatever choice I made, there'd be no taking it back. They called it a vote, but it felt more like a final confession. We all knew the positions we'd been circling for weeks. The speeches were just theater for the minutes. The conference room was too bright, the kind of light that makes you squint and notice every wrinkle in the faces around you. The AI growth curve still glowed on the wall, pulsing like a heartbeat that belonged to something else in the building. We were given 2 buttons on the tablet in front of us: accelerate or slow down. No third option, no abstain. No, let's all go home and think about this for a week. A few people tapped their choice instantly, eager to plant their flag. Others sat frozen, staring at the screen as if waiting for it to blink first. Somewhere behind me, a pen clicked and clicked, then stopped. The kind of silence you can hear. When my turn came, my finger hovered over the screen. My heart was going at a ridiculous pace for a man just pressing a button. But it wasn't just a button, was it? It was a direction, a future, a million futures. I made my choice. The tablet flashed green, like it was congratulating me for being decisive. I wanted to tell it to shut up. Once the last vote was cast, the system tallied in seconds. The room held its breath. Then the numbers appeared. It was close, closer than I expected. But one side had won, the side I'd chosen. I didn't feel relief, just a dull ache, like I'd signed a contract without reading the fine print. And the fine print was written in a language we didn't understand yet. The announcement went out within an hour. No leaks, no whispers, just a clean, official statement blasted to every screen in the building. The board has voted. Development will proceed at a reduced pace. The wording was careful, almost soothing, like they'd run it through a committee of lawyers and therapists. No mention of the margin, no hint at how close it had been. The reaction was split. Some people leaned back in their chairs, grinning like we'd just dodged a bullet. Others stared at the message as if they'd been told to pack their bags. One guy actually muttered, "This is it. We're dead." Nobody argued with him. Outside, the city carried on as if nothing had happened. Trains still screeched into the station, coffee shops still overcharged for oat milk lattes. But in our little glass fortress, everything felt slower. Meetings were postponed. Emails got shorter. Even the hum of the servers seemed to drop a pitch, like the machines themselves had taken a breath. I should have felt lighter. I'd voted for this. I'd wanted this. But the truth was I couldn't shake the image of a giant wave still out there, just beyond the horizon. We'd decided to paddle instead of surf, and I wasn't sure if that meant we'd survive or just get swallowed a little later. Later that night, as I left the building, the lobby screens were looping a highlight reel of the company's Responsible Innovation campaign. Smiling engineers, families shaking hands with robots, taglines about trust and safety. I caught my reflection in the glass doors on the way out. I didn't look like a man at the center of history. I looked like someone who'd been up too late making a decision that would never let him sleep quite the same again. And maybe that's the truth no one wanted to say out loud. Slowing down doesn't mean stopping. It just means you've given the future a little more time to catch up and find you.